She's right, you know. One of them chirped between sips of Pinot. You are boring. But hey, we need at least one of those in every group, right? They all laughed. Harder than they needed to. Louder than necessary. She looked at him across the table, that rehearsed smirk stretching her lips like she was performing stand-up. He's harmless. Sweet. But boring, she repeated, this time for the friend who had just arrived late. He didn't flinch. Didn't crack. Just sat there with that same polite smile, the one they mistook for cluelessness. He topped off their glasses, asked the waitress for extra napkins when someone spilled sauce on her dress, paid the check without anyone noticing, and offered to drive them all home, so no one risks a DUI. Her friends cooed. One patted his shoulder like he was a rescue dog. He opened the car door for them, adjusted the heat, played soft jazz on the way back like he always did. And he said nothing. But once the last of them was dropped off and she had passed out on the couch with one heel still on and her mascara smudged from laughing too hard, he went to his study, locked the door, sat down at the desk no one had ever asked about, unplugged a small USB drive hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of The Art of War, and clicked open an encrypted folder titled Edelbrook Holdings. The screen dimmed automatically. He never kept it bright. Habit. Discipline. Inside were spreadsheets, flowcharts, acquisition trails, and contact reports dating back 6 years. Quiet purchases, silent votes, legal memos, proxy letters. A single email chain with the subject line, Merger Readiness, Confidential, Stage 3. It had always been theoretical, until now. Until her little performance. Not that this was the first time she'd made him a punchline. Mr. Vanilla. Spreadsheet lover. Human post-it note. Her favorite. Whispered into her wine after 3 glasses. I thought I married power. I got peace and quiet. Then laughter. Always that same brittle, self-satisfied laughter. The kind of laugh people use when they need a mirror to believe their own performance. But tonight's comment hit different. Not because of what she said, but because of when she said it. Because tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp, her father's company was entering merger talks. Quiet ones. Discreet. Final stage. The kind where signatures matter less than leverage. And the man across the table would be him. Not as her husband. Not as the polite chauffeur who brought them hors d'oeuvres on charcuterie boards he designed himself. Not the man who fixed the sink without calling a plumber. But the man listed in the second paragraph of the shareholder rights summary, the silent majority stakeholder of the acquisition group. His name wasn't even on the official papers, at least, not the name she knew. It wasn't rage he felt. It hadn't been rage in years. He'd gone past that long ago, past disappointment, past resentment. This was something colder, cleaner. The quiet satisfaction of holding a blade no one sees, because they never cared to look. She said he was boring. She said it with the confidence of someone who thought she had already read the whole book, never realizing she'd skipped every footnote. He leaned back, watching the loading bar crawl as the final report decrypted. 5 years of work, all leading to a single point, tomorrow's meeting. He didn't need her love anymore. He didn't even need her respect. But he did want one thing. Recognition. And not from her. From her father. Because the man who had once smirked at their engagement, called him safe, and offered a condescending toast to dependability at their wedding, would look across the conference table tomorrow and recognize exactly who he'd let into the family. He closed the laptop, turned off the desk light, walked back into the living room. She was still passed out. Her phone, unlocked, lit up with a message from one of her friends. You're lucky he's so dull. Makes you look shinier by comparison. He stared at the screen, then at her. She had no idea. Before we go further, I'll just say this. If you're enjoying the story, even just curious where it's going, take a second and hit subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it tells us to keep pushing forward. No pressure, but thanks in advance. He took the phone, placed it gently on the coffee table, and headed to bed. In less than 12 hours, the word boring would become a joke even she wouldn't laugh at. Not when her father realized exactly who she'd been mocking for all these years. She was in the living room, comparing floral centerpieces on her iPad and yelling across the house. Do you think navy napkins make the gold charger plates look cheap? He didn't answer. He was in the study with the door cracked, staring at the articles of incorporation for a limited holding company he was about to file under the name Stonebarrow Capital. No one would ever trace it back to him, not directly. He'd set up the LLC through a law firm in Delaware. Their mailroom handled the rest. He was still just Mark at home, just her husband at every dinner. The one people made polite conversation with about local taxes and commuter traffic while they tried to remember his last name. But by the time she finished debating over seating chart fonts, He had already created the skeleton key that would let him unlock what none of them realized they had left unattended: control. It started small. A dozen shares here, tucked into an underperforming logistics supplier. A board observer seat through a proxy on a family-owned packaging firm. He never made noise. Never walked in as the owner. Just voted. Quietly. Wisely. And when his vote tipped a cost restructure or a policy shift, no one asked who the ghost hand belonged to. That was the thing about power. Everyone noticed when you walked into the room screaming. No one noticed when you sat at the edge of the table and rearranged the place settings. She always said he was too cautious. Too passive. "You never take risks, Mark," she told him once while swirling her wine. "That's why I never worry about you doing anything stupid." He nodded, said nothing, and then quietly invested in a compliance firm auditing her father's supply chain. She was right, in a way. He didn't take risks. He built guarantees. There was a moment, about 3 years in, when he considered telling her. Just once. Not the full picture, of course, just that he had more going on than retirement savings and index funds. But she came home early that day, giddy from brunch, laughing as she showed him a photo of a friend's new boyfriend. "Can you believe she picked that guy? Total background character. Like you, but with worse shoes." He remembered smiling. He remembered nodding. And he remembered, very clearly, never bringing it up again. Because it had become clear, invisibility was no longer an accident. It was an asset. While she hosted fundraisers to impress the same people who never called her back, he drafted quarterly reports. While she posted filtered selfies at galas, he bought into the catering company that handled the catering. He knew the real margin wasn't in the party. It was in the vendor. Sometimes, he even used her events. A handshake with someone from her father's logistics arm turned into a lunch. That lunch turned into a silent co-investment through a different LLC. The chain of ownership curved and twisted like a spiderweb. If you tugged on it, you might notice something shift. But no one ever looked. He didn't want to own her father's company. Not at first. It was messy, bloated, and burdened by too many legacy deals. But once he saw how carelessly it was all held together, once he realized no one was watching the back door, it stopped being a game. It became a responsibility. After all, someone had to protect the pieces once the boardroom chess match began. And unlike the rest of them, he actually studied the game. His first test came with the vendor buyout 2 years ago. Her father tried to bully a small logistics outfit into exclusivity. What he didn't know was that Mark already owned 38% of that vendor, through a shell backed by a trust in Arizona. The deal collapsed. Her father blamed immature leadership and never looked deeper. Good. The boring man wasn't just buying shares. He was buying silence. And silence, when leveraged correctly, doesn't just scream louder. It replaces the voice entirely. By the time she started joking about how he still hasn't figured out how to explain what he does, he had already bought into 3 of her father's core contractors and vetoed a deal from behind the curtain. He wasn't hiding. He was constructing a lattice of power, thread by thread, never aggressive, never fast, but unbreakable, because no one saw it forming. He used her underestimation like scaffolding, let it wrap around him like insulation. The world was full of men screaming for attention. He just waited for the moment when attention would come looking for him. And when it did, he'd be ready. Because the man she dismissed with a shrug was already 2 signatures away from becoming the person her father would one day call and whisper, voice trembling, "Who is he?" The meeting was scheduled as a formality, something to pacify the investors and soothe the board. A simple pre-alignment session with the acquisitions liaison from the potential buyer's side. Her father, Harold, barely glanced at the name on the calendar invite. It was late in the week, buried between a ribbon cutting for some foundation he barely remembered funding and a 9-hole charity game with the mayor. These meetings never mattered. The real decisions happened behind doors, between men who'd known each other since cigars were currency. So when the elevator chimed and the assistant said, "Your 215 is here," Harold didn't even look up. Not until the door opened. And then the world paused. Mark stepped in, clean-shaven, charcoal gray suit, no tie, polished watch, and a manila folder under his arm. He smiled as if nothing were amiss, as if this were a perfectly natural occurrence. "Harold," he said warmly, extending a hand. "Thanks for making the time." Harold's hand stayed on the desk for a second too long. "You're my daughter's husband?" he asked, not masking the disbelief. Mark nodded once. "Yes, but today, I represent the entity evaluating your liquidity terms." He set the folder down with a soft tap. "I'm not here to complicate anything. My only role is ensuring alignment with the strategic objectives set forth by our partners." "Partners?" Plural. Harold's brain took a half-second longer than usual to connect the dots. Mark wasn't bluffing. Not by the way he said liquidity terms. Not by the way he skipped small talk, or how he didn't bother with that cloying humility men often fake in a power imbalance. There was no imbalance here. At least, not the kind Harold was used to. "Which entity are you with again?" Harold asked, his voice low. Mark smiled gently, like a physician breaking difficult news. "I'm operating through Stonebarrow Capital, among others. I think you've seen our name in the third-party proxy filings last quarter, though we tend to use rotating counsel. Keeps things tidy." He said it all so effortlessly, like he was describing weekend plans. Harold's pulse quickened. He reached for the report on his desk and flipped through the last few pages. There it was. Stonebarrow. Small enough to seem forgettable, but tied, in footnotes and addendums, to several other firms. Together, they held more leverage than he'd realized. A few had voting influence. One had veto power. Another controlled access to post-acquisition operating lines. And all of them, every damn one, had been quiet. Too quiet. Until now. "I see," Harold muttered, though he didn't. He reached for the bottle of scotch behind the desk. "Drink." Mark waved it off. "Not during due diligence." Harold poured himself a double. His hand trembled just slightly. "I suppose this is where you make your demands," he said, tone hardening. "Actually," Mark replied, glancing at his watch, "this is where I listen. The board was hoping for a brief presentation of your adjusted cash flow forecasts, post-divestiture. I'm just here to ensure your numbers align with our expectations. Nothing adversarial." His voice was smooth, measured, but Harold could feel it. This wasn't some eager MBA assistant hoping to impress. This was a man who had already seen the balance sheets, already reviewed the exits, already built the trap, and Harold had walked right into it, smiling. "You're just here to ensure alignment," Harold repeated. "You expect me to believe this isn't personal?" "Why would it be?" Mark asked, eyes steady. "We're all professionals here." That word, professionals, hit harder than any insult, because Harold suddenly realized what was happening wasn't an attack. It was a restructuring, not of the company, of the family. The son-in-law he'd mocked for years, the one who brought the wrong wine to dinners, who never joined the golf trips, who always disappeared before the real conversation started, was sitting across from him with all the power and none of the theatrics. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to raise his voice. He just needed to listen. Harold sat down. Mark opened the folder. The first page was a diagram of overlapping equity structures. His finger tapped the part where the holding companies converged. "This section here is why we requested this meeting. There's a small redundancy in vendor overlap. We'd like to avoid confusion on integration." Harold stared at the diagram, but couldn't process it. His throat was dry. "You're really doing this?" Mark looked up, and for the first time in the conversation, his eyes sharpened. "You assumed you knew who I was," he said. "I just let you." There it was. Not said with malice. Not even satisfaction. Just truth. The meeting lasted 32 minutes. Harold didn't remember most of it. Just the moment when he realized the man across from him wasn't family anymore. He was the acquisition. And Harold? He was just a line item in someone else's strategy. It was always a joke to her, his little spreadsheets. That's what she called them. Mark in his spreadsheets. She'd snort during girls' nights, holding her wine glass like a mic stand. He treats index funds like they're endangered species. Obsesses over dividends like he's building a treehouse out of them. Her friends laughed on cue. One time, she even pulled up a photo of his home office. Just a blurry shot of a whiteboard covered in ticker symbols and sticky notes. "This is what I wake up next to. CNBC and dry erase markers." Sexy, right? What she didn't realize, what she never once bothered to ask, was that behind every dry erase scribble was a company tied directly, subtly, to her father's empire. It wasn't accidental. He never bought into these businesses because they were hot. He bought because they were vulnerable, because he had access, because at every birthday dinner, every champagne toast, her father would brag just a little too loud about margins and supplier negotiations. And while the rest of the table rolled their eyes, Mark listened, took mental notes, asked one or two innocent questions that never raised alarms. "Is Hellgrove still your main packaging vendor? You ever think of verticalizing the last-mile logistics? How's the return process on your overseas warehousing arm?" The answers were always handed over like candy. Because who would worry about Mark? He was family. Boring, safe, helpful Mark. Meanwhile, Hellgrove was the first domino to fall. A supplier with soft accounting, poor inventory oversight, and a board desperate for fresh capital. Mark offered quiet investment through an anonymous group out of Boston. By the time the deal closed, Stone Barrow owned 54%. No one checked the backers. Then came Rennick's freight. Not sexy, but essential. Her father tried to renegotiate terms that would have crippled them. Mark advised against it, from the shadows, and Rennick's walked. Boardroom chaos ensued. An emergency procurement scramble followed. His wife thought her father looked tired because of stress. She made him a care package. Mark quietly vetoed a stopgap contract through a third party he also happened to control. The third? Sable Core Industrial Finishing. A dusty old name buried in the spreadsheets her father's team barely reviewed. They thought they owned a majority. They didn't. A convertible note had triggered 3 quarters ago. The majority now lived in Mark's pocket. The fourth was the most brutal. A tech automation firm named Vegasys. Fast-growing, lean, and until recently, hungry for partnership. Her father offered them an exclusive integration deal, one that would have cut their market flexibility in half. They declined, politely, firmly, because Mark told them to. He wasn't on the payroll. He wasn't in the room. But he'd been advising Vegasys for almost 2 years, under a consultancy name registered to a different state and managed by a man who technically didn't exist. So when she said he dabbled, when she made those snide comments over brunch, she was laughing at a man who was already controlling the throttle on her family's cash flow. But she didn't see it, because she never asked. Because what Mark does was always too boring to care about. Until the Saturday, she saw her father's hands shaking. He was seated at the breakfast bar, legal pads spread in front of him, muttering to himself about supplier blackouts and operational sabotage. She thought he was being dramatic. Tried to make a joke, something about too much espresso and not enough melatonin. He looked up and said, "Do you know who owns Vegasys?" She shrugged. "Some West Coast guys, right?" He didn't answer, just handed her a printed web registry. She scanned it and frowned. "What am I looking at?" Their largest advisory group is Carver Partners. Carver is owned by an entity called Minton East Holdings. Minton East is Stone Barrow. She blinked. "Your husband sits on Stone Barrow's strategic board." She laughed. "No, he doesn't. He'd have told me." Harold didn't laugh. "I thought so too." Later that night, she waited for him in the hallway. "You're consulting for Vegasys?" she asked casually. "I have relationships there," he said without flinching. "What's the concern?" She stared at him. "You said you were investing in indexes." "I am," he replied. "Just not the ones you think." She tried to brush it off, called him a spreadsheet addict, told him not to overthink things. But she didn't sleep that night. Because suddenly, every family dinner, every boardroom crisis, every vendor issue, was tangled in the same invisible thread. And the thread led straight back to her boring husband. She didn't know the half of it. He wasn't a shareholder anymore. He was the hinge, the fulcrum, the silent force propping up the entire structure. And if he walked, it would all come crashing down. The second call didn't come through the assistant. It didn't come through legal. It came at 6:04 p.m. from Harold's personal number, straight to Mark's phone. Something that hadn't happened since the rehearsal dinner 3 years ago when Harold had called to say, "Just don't embarrass her. That's all I ask." Now his voice was different. No preamble, no puffed-up bravado. Just, "Can we meet?" Mark said yes, gave a time, chose the place. An unassuming private room at a quiet old-world steakhouse on the edge of downtown. No valet, no photographers. The kind of place where billionaires and former senators disappeared for hours without being seen. When Harold arrived, he looked older than usual. Shoulders stooped slightly forward. Tie loosened. His usual alpha gait reduced to something that looked like thoughtfulness, though it might have just been fatigue. Or fear. They sat. The server brought them both Macallan 18 without asking. Harold took his neat. Mark let the ice melt a little. No business at first. Harold talked about golf. About traffic. About the weather. Mark nodded politely. Patient. Listening. He had become excellent at letting people get comfortable enough to say what they'd rather leave unsaid. Finally, Harold cleared his throat. "We'd like to propose a delay." Mark let one eyebrow rise. Harold continued. "Just 6 months. Maybe a year. Let things cool down, restructure some terms, address the misunderstandings." "Which terms specifically?" Mark asked. "The voting rights. Vendor thresholds. Acquisition consolidation. So everything." Mark nodded slowly, not answering, just letting the weight of it settle between them. Harold took a sip of scotch, eyes scanning the room even though they were alone. "You have leverage. I won't pretend you don't. But what's leverage without trust?" Mark tilted his head. "Interesting question. I'm not here to fight," Harold said, voice dipping. "I'm asking for partnership, continuity, stability. And the family?" A pause. Harold smiled tightly. Family stays intact. Of course. Another silence. But there's one condition, Harold said finally, setting his glass down like he was about to deliver wisdom. Family loyalty. Mark's face didn't move. Family loyalty, he repeated. You mean silence. Harold looked away, then back. Said nothing. There it was. Not an olive branch. A muzzle. They didn't want peace. They wanted invisibility. For Mark to become background noise again. For his power to exist only in service of theirs. No visibility. No public stake. No humiliation. Just quiet compliance dressed up as partnership. Mark leaned back. I have a question, he said. Who do you think I'm doing this for? Harold frowned. Yourself. No, Mark said softly. You think this is revenge. Or ambition. It's neither. This is structure. Stability. You call it control. I call it insurance. Against what? Against the exact moment you just attempted. A half-clever bribe disguised as family unity. A hand on my shoulder while your other hand reaches for the knife. Harold's nostrils flared. Don't lecture me, son. I'm not your son. That landed. Harold picked up his glass again, but didn't drink. You really going to let the deal go through? He asked, one last flicker of pride leaking through the cracks. Mark didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was decisive. A void no words could fill without sounding ridiculous. They finished their drinks. Harold left first. No handshake. Mark stayed behind, letting the last ice cube rattle around the bottom of his glass, watching the swirl of what could have been one final lie between them melt away. The next morning, at 9:15 a.m., the merger moved forward. No delay, no restructuring, no additional meetings. The family didn't hold the reins anymore. And none of them realized yet that Mark hadn't just taken the wheel. He'd rebuilt the entire carriage while they were still choosing the color of the seat cushions. Harold didn't call again. But in the coming days, he would understand. You can't negotiate with someone who has already decided your terms are irrelevant. Mark didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need revenge. He had something better. Options. And now, he was deciding which ones to exercise and how deep the knife should go. It started over eggs Benedict and bottomless mimosas. The table was buzzing with weekend plans and mildly scandalous office gossip when Amanda, the loud one, cocked her head and said, I swear I saw your husband on Bloomberg last week. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just casually confused, like she was trying to match a face to a vaguely remembered dream. Across the table, her wife, his wife, blinked slowly, fork midair. Mark, she said, laughing. You probably saw some guy who looked like him. Mark doesn't do media. No, I'm serious, Amanda insisted, pulling out her phone. It was a quick segment during market updates. Something about infrastructure restructuring. The ticker said interim chair, Stonebarrow Capital. That's your Mark's name, right? Her smile stayed in place, but the back of her neck prickled. That's just a coincidence. He's more of a behind-the-scenes kind of guy. But then Danielle, the one with the finance bro boyfriend, chimed in. Wait, I heard that voice too. During that merger coverage yesterday. The press call between Elridge Systems and a private consortium? The one everyone's whispering about. They all looked at her now. Are you telling me? Danielle said slowly. You didn't know your husband is connected to that deal? There was a pause, just half a second too long. She felt it like a tremor beneath her chair, an unspoken shift. Her fingers tightened around her glass. Mark wouldn't. He's not even. She stopped herself. Amanda leaned in, voice low now. Sweetie, I think your husband is a little more Wall Street than you've been letting on. She laughed, a sharp sound she didn't mean to make. That's ridiculous. He spends his weekends organizing the garage. But brunch had ended. At least, for her. She got home before the valet even brought the car, slammed the front door, walked straight past the kitchen, and climbed the stairs to his office. It was locked. Of course it was. So she went to her laptop, typed his full name into Google, expected the usual noise, maybe a LinkedIn profile with 3 connections, a boring tax blog he'd bookmarked, maybe a Reddit post about spreadsheet shortcuts. What she found instead stopped her breath mid-exhale. Stonebarrow Capital appoints interim chair amid strategic acquisition. His name, full name, right there. Quoted. She clicked. There he was, standing beside a boardroom podium in a slate gray suit she had never seen before. The caption read, Mark J. Kessler, speaking at the annual Infrastructure Consolidation Summit. A summit she hadn't even known he attended. Another article, Quiet Power, How Private Capital is Reshaping Family-Owned Industry, had him listed as a notoriously discreet architect of modern vertical acquisitions. She opened the SEC filing linked in one of the footnotes. He was named 3 times. Once as strategic advisor, once as voting representative, once as interim chair of a capital structure she couldn't even begin to diagram. Her palms started sweating. Then came the interview clip. Just audio, no video. But it was his voice. Calm, slow, talking about vendor realignment and synergistic liquidity pathways, like he was reciting a grocery list. We've chosen to keep the original board partially intact for cultural continuity. That said, strategic control has shifted. There's no need to make noise about it. Most change happens best in silence. She slammed the laptop shut, stood up too fast, lost her balance, caught herself on the edge of the desk. Her heart was pounding so hard it was all she could hear. For years, she'd told friends he was a harmless routine, a dependable house cat, the kind of man who never rocked the boat because he didn't even know boats existed. But now she realized she hadn't been living with a house cat. She'd been living with a glacier. Slow, silent, and absolutely devastating once it moved. Every joke, every eye roll, every sigh she'd let out when he declined to talk about his boring little projects, they were all coming back now, echoed by the sound of his voice quoted in national media, dictating the future of her father's company. The mask had cracked, and what terrified her most wasn't that he'd been hiding something. It was that he hadn't. She had just never looked, never listened, never asked. And now the man she thought she married was being discussed in rooms she couldn't even get into. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "Sweetheart, call your father." Immediately, she didn't move. Because for the first time in years, she realized she had no idea what Mark did for a living. And even worse, she had no idea what he was about to do next. The door slammed so hard it knocked one of the framed prints crooked. She didn't bother fixing it. She crossed the room like a storm in heels, her voice already trembling from rage, or panic, maybe both. "You used me." He didn't look up right away. Just finished typing something into a secure terminal, clicked save, and finally raised his eyes. Calm. Still. The same expression he wore when she asked him to clean out the gutters or check if the oven pilot light was out. "You used me to get to my father. You've been manipulating my family from day one. Why didn't you tell me?" He tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to a podcast at 1.5x speed. "I told you I worked in infrastructure," he said. "Infrastructure," she spat. "You made it sound like plumbing. Not this. I never lied. You never told me the truth. I told you everything you were willing to hear." That stopped her for a beat. She folded her arms. "You married into power. You picked me because you knew what my family controlled." That got a reaction. He stood up slowly, not with threat, not with guilt, but gravity. A man adjusting his posture before delivering news he's already emotionally processed. "No," he said. "I married you. Because I loved you. I thought that mattered." He walked around the desk, pulled a slim black folder from a drawer, handed it to her like it weighed nothing. "Open it." She didn't move. "Open it." She did. Inside were documents, graphs, and contracts. Names she recognized, subsidiaries, shell firms, minor vendors, all tied to her father's ecosystem. Each had a line connecting them to a single phrase stamped at the top of every page. Stonebarrow Holdings, Debt Managed Portfolio A. She flipped pages faster. Her father's name appeared once. Then again. Payment schedules. Renegotiated terms. 2 properties in escrow. A convertible debt agreement due to mature in less than 90 days, with a clause that shifted voting rights to the note holder. "Is this all under you?" she whispered. "Yes. You own his debt. Manage it," he said. "On the conditions of renewal. On the audit schedule. On the default terms." He signed it, quietly, through desperation and sloppiness. She stepped back like the folder had bitten her. "You're killing him." "No," Mark said. "I'm doing what you and your family refused to do. Look at the actual math. His empire has been running on borrowed grace for years. I just called the bluff." She gripped the folder like it could anchor her. "I don't understand. Why now? Why this way?" "Because I gave you years. Years to ask. Years to see. But I was the harmless one. The coat holder. The driver. You never once asked what I did all those late nights. Never once asked why our taxes looked the way they did. You didn't want to know." He stepped closer. Not looming. Just present. "If you'd asked, just once, I would have shown you." She looked up at him, stunned into silence. Not by the information. By the sudden clarity that it had never been hidden. Just ignored. "You're destroying everything," she said, but it came out like a question. "No," he replied. "I'm making sure it survives. Just not under the same name." He turned back toward his desk, picked up his pen. "You said I was boring." She flinched. "You said I was safe. Predictable. You used those words like they were flaws. They weren't. They were warnings. But you never heard them. I thought I knew you, she said quietly. No. You assumed me. The silence between them was louder than any shouting could have been. She left the room clutching the folder, like it might start screaming if she dropped it. Behind her, the man she once dismissed as unremarkable sat back down and resumed typing. She had come looking for confession, but all she'd gotten was truth. And the truth was this. The betrayal wasn't in what he'd done. It was in what she'd refused to see. The ringtone tore through the dark like a fire alarm. She squinted at the screen, Dad, and instinctively braced for bad news, but not this kind. Not the kind that makes your entire reality buckle at the edges. It was 5:41 a.m. Dad, she croaked, still half asleep, heart already sprinting. His voice came through ragged, breathless, like he'd been running, or maybe falling. Do you know who your husband really is? No preamble. No hello. Just that. She sat up straight in bed. The room was still cold from the night, but sweat was already forming behind her knees. What are you talking about? The merger, he said. It just finalized. 10 minutes ago. We got the final docs from legal. The filings hit the wire. She tried to keep up. Okay, and there was a pause. Then, in a tone she'd never heard from him in her entire life, fragile, confused, afraid, he said, He's the holding company. She blinked. What? Mark. Your husband. He's the holding company. That doesn't make sense. What are you? He owns the controlling interest. It's him. Every single percentage point. The entire consolidation trail leads back to a structure under his name. He just flipped the entire thing while we were sleeping. No, she said, breath catching. That's not possible. I don't understand. Who is he? Her father snapped, voice cracking. Who did you marry? She stared at the wall, the grain of the wooden headboard blurring as tears rose uninvited. He told me he worked in infrastructure. Infrastructure? Infrastructure. Jesus Christ, Lydia. This isn't some zoning contract. He just took the board from underneath us. He's the majority now. Not just of the merger firm, of us. He owns us. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Tell me you knew, he said quietly. Tell me you knew something. Anything. She said nothing. Lydia, he pleaded, a whisper now. Tell me you didn't let this happen blind. But she had. She had let it happen over breakfasts where she scrolled Instagram and didn't ask about his day. Over dinners where she talked about other people's ambition while ignoring the silence in the man beside her. Over years of mocking what she thought was small, unthreatening dullness. Never seeing the cold architecture behind his quiet. She had married the chess master and spent years ridiculing him for how slowly he moved the pawns. She whispered, I didn't know. Her father didn't yell. That would have been easier. He just exhaled, long, shaky, and broken. Then we're finished. The line went dead. She sat in bed, phone still pressed to her ear, even though the silence on the other end was absolute. A mechanical hum. No voice. No rescue. And somewhere downstairs, Mark was probably drinking coffee. Probably dressed. Probably already on a call with legal, talking next steps. Because he had seen the board. He had known what pieces to move. And she had been too busy laughing at his shoes. The horror wasn't in the takeover. It was in the realization that the man now owning her father's legacy had never needed to lie. He just needed her not to pay attention. And she had obeyed perfectly. The venue was one of those architectural statements. The kind with open ceilings, custom lighting, and jazz that whispered class without trying too hard. The kind of place where deals got toasted, where futures were sealed between canapes and handshakes. He hadn't told her about the party. She found out from a LinkedIn post. A teaser photo of the event invite, Stonebarrow Holdings Strategic Alignment Celebration. No mention of him in the caption, but the logo at the bottom made her stomach drop. So she dressed carefully, conservative but flattering. Something she'd worn once to a charity dinner where she pretended to care about marine conservation. The dress always worked in rooms like this. People smiled. Heads turned. She told herself it would work again. He wouldn't say no. He wouldn't dare. But when she arrived, the doorman asked for her name and didn't find it. She gave his. They let her in. Inside, she paused, surveying the room like a reconnaissance mission. Polished executives everywhere. Faces she half recognized from her father's world, now orbiting in a constellation around his. He stood near the back, in front of a glass wall overlooking the skyline. No spotlight, no stage. Just him, confident, calm, fielding quiet conversations with power brokers twice his age. When he entered the room earlier, someone had clapped. She missed it, but she heard the echoes. The way people moved toward him like tide toward the moon. Senior partners from Elridge, banking leads from Vegas, a former senator's son who now ran his family's compliance firm. They were all lined up, one after the other, smiling. She hovered by the bar, smiled too tightly at anyone who glanced her way, sipped a drink she didn't want. Not one person acknowledged her. No one said, "Oh, you must be Mark's wife." Because in that room, she wasn't. In that room, she was just a woman in a nice dress with no name tag. She tried to move closer, rehearsed something casual to say, "You forgot to tell me about this one." But every time she took a step, another executive filled the space. Another hand to shake. Another nod of deference. And then it happened. The new CEO of her father's firm approached him. A man she knew, by name, by face, by family. A man who used to eat at her parents' house, who once complimented her wine selection. He didn't glance at her. Instead, he stepped in front of Mark, offered a respectful handshake, and said, "Sir, congratulations." She froze. "Sir." Then, more softly, with a humility that dripped down every syllable, "Your discretion has been deeply appreciated. The transition's been seamless." "Truly." Mark nodded once. "I prefer the work to speak louder than the names attached." The CEO smiled. "And it has." Then he stepped away. She took a half step toward her husband. He didn't look at her, didn't search the room, didn't scan for her face. He was too busy talking with the legal chair from the vendor he'd quietly acquired 6 months ago. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The dress? Useless. The smile? Exhausted. The woman who used to own the narrative of his life now stood invisible at the edge of his victory. The barback walked past her, glanced her way, then passed again. And then, without another word, without waiting for the moment to pass, she turned and walked out. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing louder in her own ears than in the room behind her. No one followed. No one called her name. No one noticed. The door closed behind her with a soft finality. Outside, the wind was colder than she expected, the kind that cuts through fabric and memory alike. She wrapped her arms around herself, not for warmth, but to remember where she began and ended. Inside that room, Mark wasn't her husband. He was the storm they never saw coming. And she was just another relic of the world he'd already rewritten. She was sitting at the kitchen island when he walked in. The house was too quiet, like it had been holding its breath all evening. She hadn't turned on any lights, just let the soft blue from the fridge wash over the counter like stage lighting for a scene neither of them wanted to act out. He didn't say anything at first, just hung his coat, loosened his collar, poured himself a glass of water. He looked tired, not worn out, not defeated, just done, like a man who had finally finished a long, meticulous job no one thanked him for. She watched him from her stool, not accusatory, not pleading, just waiting, a glass of red wine in front of her, untouched. "Why?" she asked, voice small, almost gentle. He took a sip of water, set the glass down, then sat across from her, resting his forearms on the cool marble surface. "You told people I was boring," he said. Not angry, not bitter, just factual, like reading aloud from a report. She winced. "I didn't mean." He cut her off, still calm. "You said I had no ambition, that I was safe, predictable." She swallowed, her hands wrapped around the wine glass like it might offer something solid to hold on to. "I thought you wanted a quiet life," she said, barely audible. "I did," he replied. "I built everything around that idea. Peace, stability, dependability. I thought that was the goal." He paused, then leaned back in the chair. "But the thing about being underestimated," he said, "it gives you access no one guards. It lets you sit in rooms where powerful men say too much, because they don't think you matter. It lets you build without interruption, move without suspicion, wait without pressure." She looked at him, really looked. For the first time in years, she wasn't seeing her husband. She was seeing the man behind the man, the one who never fought for the spotlight because he was busy building the floor beneath it. "I wasn't hiding," he said. "I was watching, listening. And when the moment came to act, I didn't need to announce anything. I just moved." Her voice cracked. "You did all this behind my back." He gave the faintest smile. Not cruel, not smug, just resigned. "No, I did it beside you. You just never turned your head." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't cry. Not now. Not when she finally understood that the man she mocked for years was the one holding the fuse the entire time. "I didn't know you could be this cold," she whispered. "I'm not," he said. "But silence feels like ice to people who only notice it after the burn." He stood slowly, picked up his glass, walked toward the doorway. She stared at the back of him, willing herself to speak, to say something that would unspin what had been set in motion. "Mark." He stopped. I never meant to make you feel invisible. He turned his head slightly. Just enough for his voice to carry, not enough for her to see his face. You didn't make me feel invisible, he said. You just assumed I had nothing to see. And then he disappeared down the hallway. She looked around the kitchen, the appliances, the granite, the pendant lighting she chose during their first remodel. Her domain. Her aesthetic. Her control. Except it wasn't hers anymore. Not legally. Not technically. Not even sentimentally. Because all of this, had been built on the assumption that he was content playing background noise. And she had never once listened to the rhythm of what that silence meant. He was already at the door when he said it. Calm, steady, final. You call me boring. A pause. But your father just called me sir. Then the door closed. And she was left alone in the house that no longer remembered her name.